Hi, I'm Roy Collin, and I'm the creator of the podcast. You can find everything about me and the 5 podcasts on bio.link/podcaster, and you'll find it in the QR code there. I'd also like to thank my sponsors. If you or someone you know is struggling with anxiety and want to know how to be 100% anxiety free in 6 weeks without therapy or drugs, Daniel Packard Anxiety Solution Program Company offers a 6 weeks system that permanently solves anxiety at an astounding 90% success rate. People who join the program only pay at the end once they have clear, measurable results. If you're interested in learning more, go to permanentanxietysolutions.com where you can book a free consultation with Daniel. Do you have high blood pressure and want to get off the meds? Doctors are amazed at what Zona Plus can do. Get a $50 discount with my code ROY. Go to zona.com/discount/ROY and you see the QR code for all my sponsors down at the end. Quality Polish manufacturer of metal products for telecommunication and workshop equipment and other metals. If you'd like a brochure, you see it in the QR code and you just let us know if you would like a quotation shipped internationally and very competitive rates. I hope you enjoy this week's podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Freedom International Livestream. And we thank you all the time for supporting us, whether you like it, you subscribe, you share, you participate in the conversation now or in the future. We're always grateful because we want you to be part of what we feel that it is important for us and for the whole community or wherever we belong and for the whole nations. So today we are very happy to have our guest, Jim Steele, and I'll tell you more about him. But it's just nice that someone who is an expert in, in anything that relates to climate change, climate crisis, or whatever you want to call it, gives us time to be with us. Okay, so he's one of those that I truly appreciate, and he is a ecologist, and for me, he's also a biologist because he both have a degree in ecology and biology, all from San Francisco State University. But before I continue about Jim, I want to make a shout out to the CO2 coalition.org, particularly Greg Wrightstone, who's been our first guest from CO2 Coalition. Because whenever we want to have someone who's an expert in certain specific topic about truth in our environment and our climate, and I go to him and thank you, Greg, and we'll have you again in the future, but thank you for always helping us through. Because of that, we've had Patrick Moore, Mark Morano, Frank Lassie, and now we have Jim Still. So we're just going to make a collection of CO2 coalition scientists, because for me it's one incredible group of scientists who are skeptics, maybe skeptics, but without those skeptics, we will never know the truth. So we also, Roy, Carl, welcome you, and I am truly humbled that all of you could be with us. So Jim, as I was saying earlier, is that he also became the dean of the College of.
Let
He
me
was a
correct that. I wasn't the dean. I was the director
director.
of a field station. Some people have called me dean. I like to think just because they think I'm smart. But no, just I was the director of the field station.
Yeah, the director.
The dean's the one that hired me. So
the dean knows better. He didn't make a mistake. That's all I would tell you.
That dean that hired me was a skeptic also. So we got along very well.
So we are all in safe space, even through this live stream. And as an ecologist, you did write that in order to understand and observe wildlife population changes, you also had to understand the effects of landscape changes, fire ecology, and climate cycles such as El Nino and La Nina. So there's the little bit. Anything more that we need to know? Oh, don't forget, he also wrote a book sometime in early 20s. So what was that? What year was that?
2013, I published that book.
Right. They published the book, and in the landscapes and cycles and an environmental journey to climate skepticism. So the website is still there, but it may not be up to date, but the website is there. Okay. And so Jim's contact, if you care to get in touch with him, is he feels freely to share his email, and it's jsteele@sfsu.edu. And do follow him in the YouTube. We just search Jim Steele, and thank goodness he's still there, because like Roy and I have no more YouTube. So while he's in the YouTube, do get some information and get some education. So Jim, thank you so much. And you know why I is thought of inviting someone about the fires is, as we all know, there have been so many fires all over. So the first thing that some people would always think that it's natural fires, or they call it like wildfires, and they relate it to natural fires. But you would be the best first person for me to ask, if you could start by just helping us understand what is a natural fire, and what causes a natural fire, and how many of these recent fires like Maui, like the fire in Greece, or that of that can be considered natural fires, and if not, why not? So please lead us to that conversation.
Okay, you really have two sources of ignition. And, in the United States, the data shows that probably 85% of fires are started by people, by a careless campfire or a cigarette or a downed electric pole. If you look along the coast of California, and I'm just south of San Francisco, almost all the fires along the coast are set by people. Your natural fires are by lightning strikes. And so you always have light. And often, the lightning strike is about 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 28 degrees centigrade. You Irish go by centigrade, right? Okay. So, but those happen in certain places. So in California, Sierra Nevada, you have some summer fires that are going to be started by a lightning strike. If we look at the Maui fire, it was started by humans. It was a downed electrical pole. We had a big fire in Colorado. Colorado's biggest fire, that was started by a trash fire that got away. So different ones that happen for different reasons. We had a big fire called the Beckwith Fire, which ended up being one of the bigger fires in California 2 years ago. That was a faulty electrical grid. So if we look at just natural fires, and it's hard to separate it, if we look at all the data of wildfires, and what's been very dishonest by climate alarmists is they show an increase in wildfires in the United States, but the starting point is 1980. And really, if you look back, and a number of people, they use charcoal and tree ring scars and whatever. If we go back before the 1900s, there were far more fires, hundreds of more fires than we see now. Now, how many of those are natural is not easily deciphered, because Native Americans often set fires to clear the brush away. It helped, once you have a wildfire go through, you have new growth, and that's good for wildlife. So we can't quite tell exactly what's going on. In lightning, it's probably only 1 out of 1,000 lightning strikes will cause a fire. I've seen plenty of lightning scars on trees. Even though the lightning is that hot, it's only brief enough that it doesn't ignite the tree. It's usually when it goes into the ground, if there's a lot of duff on the ground, it can ignite that duff. And the biggest fires that we have, or the largest burnt areas, is due to grasses. And grasses burn very easily, or you have small little twigs that are easily ignited. I know how many of you have started campfires, but you don't put a match to a log. There's just not enough energy there. The match is 1,000 degrees temperature, but it's not going to ignite the log. You have to start with kindling. And all the fire experts, when they give a red flag warning about when are you going to have a fire, what's your fire danger. You look at the grasslands, and it was the grasses that just carried the tragic fire into La Nina in Maui. They spread real fast. They're easily ignitable. And the fire experts will call dead grasses 1 hour fuels, meaning you could have snow on the ground the day before, have it melt in 1 hour of dry noontime temperatures, that grass could be flammable. Now, I grew up in New England, and I know in that area, a lot of people say, well, once the snow melts, I can go make a trash burn, get rid of the leaves and everything from the winter. Well, they had to do public service announcements warning people that just because the snow disappeared yesterday doesn't mean all that vegetation's not going to burn. So because people just get a misunderstanding. And if you have all this 1 hour fuel, it's just ludicrous that a climate alarmist can say the climate is causing these things to burn more. Climate is going to be change is going to be measured over 30, 40 years. And here you have vegetation that's being ignited just because it dried for an hour. But they try to make that link. And it's really a dishonest representation of what happens. And I'm going to shut up for a second and see if you have some questions for clarity here.
And in many times that you had that interviews and conversation, you always speak about the change in the landscape and the change in relation to the people migrating or to the plants being imported. So I remember my study when I was taking my master's, and I had an ethnobotany study, and I was in Hawaii. And that was part of the critical thinking that my professor mentioned. And I too was like, I never thought about the effect of the people in migrating to the landscape and then to the climate. But then the plants was so crucial. I wonder if you can share us more thoughts of that, because I think it is important for people to understand that, even in our local homes, we could do something to maybe protect us from the future fires, whether it is by lightning or by human,
Right. And that's, again, the more recent case of the La Nina fire in Maui, it was invasive grasses. They had created these sugar cane plantations, pineapple plantations, and then as they became economically unfeasible, they were just abandoned. And so these invasive grasses that weren't native took over. And when they die, they're highly flammable. And as I said, they can 1 hour of dry temperatures is enough to have them ignited. The government officials knew that could be an issue. They've been warned. And what you really have to do, and for any fire, if you're camping, you kind of scrape a bare area around your wildfire so the fire can't get away and ignite those grasses or twigs. Anybody is living in what you call the urban wilderness interface, where you're interacting with the forest and whatever, you're supposed to set up a mosaic where you prevent the fire from coming to your house. So you scrape out bare ground someplace, you get rid of the grasses, you get rid of some of the shrubs with the tiny twigs that are easily ignitable, and you try to minimize any way that fire can be carried to your house. What happened to La Nina, and I've seen it in a number of places in California, when people have made these developments out into the wild, the houses are very close together. And if the fire reaches just one house, the heat builds up and radiates out and ignites the next house. And so what you will see in those places, you'll see rows and rows of houses all burnt to the ground. I went up to the Paradise Fire, the campfire it was called, but it was in Paradise, California. It just, all these neighborhoods were just burnt to the ground, but the trees around them were okay because they didn't hold the heat and radiate it out the way the houses did. But I went to a few places. There was a church where they were giving out all this aid to the people, and the church was not touched. The church was surrounded by a little bit of a parking lot and a large grassy lawn that was live grass. Well, the fire came right up to this growing lawn and then stopped. And it never reached the house, the church. Everything was fine. And you could see that in certain houses that were slightly separated from these more developments, that the fire got up and got one house and then burnt the whole neighborhood to the ground. These other houses that were separated and had a little bit of a fire break between them, they were saved. So the one thing people really have to think about is how close can the fire get to you for your individual house? And what you can easily do is keep mowing the grass. You know, when they go to stop a fire, the firefighters will actually bring in bulldozers to scrape the ground to bare ground, so those grasses can't carry the fire into the further along. And so if you do that, I would also say if you're in danger in certain places are going to have more fires, is maybe have a fireproof roof, because sometimes embers the wind can carry the embers to your house and start a fire. But that main thing is making a mosaic. Is what they should have done in La Nina, is what they should have done in a number of places. And if you get a spark, and it looks like they thought they put the fire out, but when the winds pick up, so any places where it's very windy, you're in a bigger danger. And that's that part of Maui is known for. The winds come from the northeast. It's the trade winds. They go over and I forget what the volcano is in Maui, but then they come down the side and they've dropped all their moisture on the north side. They're dry, heavy winds, and that just carried that fire right into La Nina. And people are aware of that. And sadly enough, it wasn't, a fire break wasn't dealt with to keep La Nina from having a fire danger. I don't know if I've rambled too much on that, but...
No, you didn't. Thank you so much. I'll pass it on for the meantime to Roy.
Thanks, Chris. I suppose, Jim, we'll get to know you a little bit, because when you came on first, I'm looking at the hats in the background and all the medals. You might let us know what's that about.
Well, I have family visiting here, so I am relegated to my wife's sewing room. And we're big sports fans. I was a Celtics fan, if that rings true for the Irish. But my wife actually was a better athlete than I was. She was a top point guard at college and a top softball outfielder. So she's been a lifelong San Francisco fan for the Warriors. And we go to games and you got bobbleheads, so there's some of that, and there's different hats. And if people don't know what to give us for Christmas or birthdays, we get sports memorabilia. So between my Boston Red Sox and Boston Celtics and her 49ers and Giants, and those are my second teams, we have a lot of winning teams to support. So what you're seeing behind me is some of that memorabilia.
Brilliant. So, like, a lot of people have seen as well helicopters pouring flames onto the forests. So there's a lot of, I don't know, the powers that be creating a lot of the fires as well. I mean, I've looked at some of your videos and you give some fantastic advice for people how to stop it. But like, I mean, have you seen things like that where we know that being intentionally they've caused the fires?
Well, I think you're confusing two things. When you see helicopters dropping these fire retardants, and often it's a little color or water, what they're trying to slow the fire down. And if it takes, before you can ignite the vegetation, you have to dry it out a little. And the fire is probably moving around and radiating out about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit heat, but it will take it almost takes 4 times as much heat to evaporate the water as it does to ignite something that's drier. So they're trying to dump water on it and slow it down and see if
this isn't water. No, this is flames. Well, are you saying that this would be to kind of stop the
well, I'm saying I'll see them do two things. I've watched them take planes come in with big buckets and they scoop into the lakes and pull up the water and then go dump it. But also some come with fire retardants, and that looks kind of reddish or pinkish. Usually when they do a prescribed burn, I've seen where they've done prescribed burns, which I think is a good thing, is what the Native Americans did to help manage the landscapes there. But they usually go with some kind of blowtorch system, and they're walking around and setting the fire, and they've kind of made certain containment mosaics to help them control it. So I've never seen them starting a fire from a helicopter or from a plane.
I've seen a few videos of that, and I was like, this doesn't make sense.
I'd be curious if you could email me
of course,
the link to the video. I'd like to look at that, because it's possible that sometimes you're trying to start a backfire, that maybe the quickest way to do that and to mobilize people is to fly over and start that backfire. So you burn out an area so the advancing fire won't advance. So it's not impossible. It's not something that I've seen, but I know they do stuff like that. It's a lot harder to have people drive out in a truck, and you can get caught in the flames if you're on the ground. So that is possible. I'd have to know the context of what you're referring to, but mostly when I see prescribed burns, they're on the ground with some kind of blowtorch type of situation that's pretty well controlled. Sometimes they get out. Some of the locals where I worked got a little nervous when the Forest Service would do prescribed burns, because they would the wind would shift and it would get away from them. So,
okay. And like Grace was mentioned, the Maui fires, and I've seen a load of videos on that, and I know there's a lot of people saying the power was turned off before, there was no alarms, the water was turned off, but I've seen people going around, and I mean, I remember when I grew up, they used to be burning out cars, and they were never looking like what you'd see there. And also there's people showing kind of like one area, all the houses around are grand, but in this little area, the cars were just burnt out. It didn't make sense how a fire could actually do that.
A lot of what I've seen from the La Nina is the housing was pretty close together, and they weren't thinking of how the fires would spread there. So it's, the houses that escaped, all these wealthy people that have been on that side of Maui, and that's the dry region of Maui. It doesn't get much rain there. That's why people like it. It's a lot of sunshine. And you get the heavy winds that will come down on that. So anytime the fire got close to a housing neighborhood where the buildings are close together, one house will ignite the next house. You just see it one after another. It's some of these things I've seen from aerial photos. I'll see 100 houses all went down, and you just had to ignite one house. You just had to get one to have it travel that way. And I guess a lot of people don't kind of realize how much heat can be radiated, because it's invisible. And probably the only sense you have it if you sit around a campfire, you're getting warm by radiation. So you're facing the campfire, your chest gets warm, but your back is cold if it's on a winter's day. But that kind of gives you a sense of the difference of how much heat can be radiated. So I don't know exactly, again, the neighborhoods that you looked at, but certainly I could see what I've seen in many different places is closely packed houses. The whole neighborhood can go once you lose one. If you don't have enough, I've seen fires in the city where they hose down the neighboring house to minimize the chance of it igniting. So,
okay. And I mean, like for those that are in the unfortunate situation of being stuck in the middle of this, is there a kind of an evacuation process, the do's and don'ts? Because I mean, obviously panic kicks in.
Absolutely. And I think that was part of the tragedy of La Nina, that they were kind of told not to hit the highways, I think, because you had limited access, and so they were kind of advising people to stay in place. And then the fire just came upon them much too quickly. So the people that kind of ignored the guidance of staying in place and snuck around the borders, they're the ones that kind of escaped, and the ones that stayed home, it was deadly. So what we'll see is they'll have to come up with a much better evacuation plan. And I think part of their general warning was not just for fires, but for tsunamis, so it wasn't specific enough. Have a certain signal, one kind of horn for one and another alarm bell for another type of disaster. How you would evacuate would be different. But I also think as they rebuild Lahaina, they're going to make sure that they get rid of those invasive grasses, make a mosaic and a better fire break to prevent any kind of fire approaching Lahaina, because the winds, once they come over the mountains, they're strong and dry, and they happen all the time. Every year they get strong winds like that. So you have one bad ignition, one faulty wire, that's all it takes. And then you have a disaster.
Okay. And with, like say, the climate change then, because what I've noticed here, they're spraying here the chemtrails. I mean, we know Bill Gates wants to block out the sun. And, like when I came here first where I'm living, it's a nice garden with a lot of trees and everything. And sometimes you'd have to cut everything twice in the year.
Oh, yeah.
I don't even think I'll have to cut it this year because I can see the difference in the clouds, and it's like the weeds will grow, but the trees aren't growing. And I see a lot of trees are actually even dying. Like they're definitely blocking out. And like there's freedom of information. There was somebody had requested it in Wales and they said, go to England. And they actually mention it's for climate, that they're spraying for climate, even though, and just your thoughts on kind of the chemtrails and what's Bill Gates up to.
Well, Bill Gates to me is an example of how you can be an idiot and make millions of dollars. To block the sun to me is just totally insane. If you, just from a climate perspective, if you look at the long-term weather stations in the United States and around the world that have over 70 years worth of data, 34% have cooling trends. So, but you average together and it looks like it's warming. And again, we have this global average. It's really driven by the Arctic sea ice that was blown out by the winds. And the Arctic Ocean has about 900 meters worth of warm, salty Atlantic water that came via the Gulf Stream into the Arctic. When the winds blow out the ice, then all this heat radiates out. So it looks like it's warming, but actually the Arctic Ocean is cooling because it's ventilating that heat. But when you average those together, it looks like warming. So then you say, okay, block the sun to stop the warming. Well, this 34% that were cooling, you're not making their life any better. And they say, oh, global warming is causing less crop production. You block the sun, you're gonna stop that. The CO2 has been great for a greening of the country. If you look at a standard greenhouse, the optimum CO2 concentration is about 1,000 parts per million to have that greenhouse grow, and you want to constantly feed it that way. But we're only at 400. So in a sense, you could say the vegetation of the world is starving for CO2 right now. And last time we had a major extinction back 252 million years ago, the Permian, CO2 was down to about 180 or lower. And they had a rainforest collapse. They had a blackout of algae in the oceans. So the lack of CO2 is probably more problematic, but it's the stories are being pushed in a different way. You weaponize every weather event and then blame it on climate. And it's all narrative. And they're getting all these kids that are totally terrified. But kids haven't even lived long enough to know what climate is. They see a tornado and think, oh, this is climate change. Well, they've happened all the time, but they're sort of brainwashing these kids. I just saw a video of Obama saying, I want you to stay angry about this and vent your anger and focus in this. They're getting all these kids to be an army of alarmists when they don't know any better. But if you have skeptic scientists, like the World Economic Forum, they brought Greta Thunberg, who was a 16-year-old actress who knows squat about climate, have her speak, but they didn't invite any skeptical scientists. The CO2 Coalition just got the 2022 Nobel Prize winner in physics joined this coalition. And he agrees with the coalition that CO2 is not the problem. this climate crisis is really a bad hoax and a misdiagnosis of what causes the Earth to warm. And I've given a few talks, and what has always amazed me is you say, well, do you think it's warmed? And I said, well, in the 1800s, it was a little ice age, and we've definitely warmed a little. The oceans, I think all the data shows the oceans have warmed a little. And I said, but it's not CO2. And they said, well, geez, if CO2 is not warming, what could it be? So no one's being taught about the other ways the Earth can warm, the other dynamics that cause these events. They try to make every event due to CO2 or made worse by CO2. And the public is actually, I think, has become more illiterate about how climate changes because of the way they've tried to focus on this narrative. And I just wonder if the World Economic Forum is doing this on purpose. They kind of want to govern everything. So why would you have?
And they're like, it's all about tax. They're just taxing people for all this, like even on airlines and everything. It's insane. Like, yeah, let's tax people to make things better.
You're gonna die if we don't save you. So that everything's scary to push us into their arms and allow them to control us. And as a scientist, you have to have debate. That's the one unpardonable sin, is not to be a skeptic about stuff. The only way science advances is by good debate, good skepticism. Someone just throws out one theory and says, I'm science, so you believe me. That's just bad science. That's just an ego trip by a single scientist. But I hear different guys saying that kind of stuff. And they've tried to shut down the debate very early on. And instead of calling you a skeptic, they call you a denier and try to make it as if we don't understand the science. But I've seen much better scientific understanding by skeptics. And I'll give you one example. Every now and then I give nature walks to the locals. And I had a couple of professors show up, and they started talking about climate change and asked me, and I said, well, I'm on a different side. I'm a skeptic here, but let's not talk about it while I'm doing this. Let's go have coffee afterwards and we'll discuss it. And I sat down, and one of the professors teaches global policy for global warming. And so I said, well, what was the research that convinced you CO2 was causing all this? And he just kind of shyly shaked his head and said, I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I'm just trusting what they say. So there's this just kind of, people are just accepting this without challenging it. And they're afraid to, and there's a number of times when if you challenge the dogma, the university or fellow professors kind of blackball you. They want you, and the more you go with the standard dogma, the more papers get accepted. And when you challenge the dogma, the journals don't accept your paper as easily. So there's a whole pressure to kind of keep this narrative going without really being challenged. And that's a horrible detriment for us to understand how to protect us from wildfires, how to protect ourselves from any kind of extremes that naturally happen. So.
Yeah. And I mean, like the problem is not everyone can have a debate and just, iron it out. It's a case of my way or the highway. And unfortunately, that's the way society, whether the jab or anything, it's all like this.
Oh, absolutely.
And if we look at like all these politicians and, rich actors, they're all living by the coast and they're trying to tell them that the sea levels are rising. You can see pictures of 100 years old and the water levels are the exact same from the pictures. And also the polar bears, like if you watch BBC and David Attenborough, they'll follow one, anorexic polar bear and they say they're all dying. And the reality is they're actually on the increase.
Well, that's, the polar bear, there was a couple of things that I got as an ecologist. It was saying all these animals are moving. And the polar bear one got me the most because it was, and I wrote about it in the book, because when there was a lot of hunting, the polar bears were down and they stopped hunting, the polar bears have come back. If for the whole food chain that keeps the polar bears alive, if you don't have melting of the ice and then refreezing, the seals couldn't exist there for the whole polar bears to hunt. If you don't have melting of the ice, you have no photosynthesis. No photosynthesis, you have no zooplankton, you have no fish, you have no seals, you're not going to have any bears. So what's gone on up in the Arctic of less ice, and the reason we've had less ice is because it was blown out of the Arctic, not because it melted from above, but it was blown out from freezing winds from Siberia. And that allowed this heat to ventilate. Well, that's been a boon for the polar bears. And then to kind of check back with you on the sea level, there were some good papers where what they've done is sometimes a tide gauge looks like the sea is rising, but it's really because the land is sinking. And that's one thing that we have done in so many different places is to feed the growing populations enough water in the cities. You pull out all the underground water in the aquifers. And when that happens, the land compresses and sinks. So one guy did a study of all the long-term, his last name was Beretti, and he looked in the southern Pacific. So he looked around New Zealand, Australia, and a couple of islands. And they had GPS systems right next to the tide gauges. And so if you subtracted the land sinking from what the tide gauge was saying, the average rise in the sea level is just 1 millimeter a year. And, 1 millimeter in a year takes it's just not going to add up to anything. You can certainly protect yourself from that. But I've here in Pacifica, California, I was on the Sea Level Rise Committee, but there are people that just want to build walls that are 20, 30 feet high. It's tremendously expensive. They call it managed retreat. Let's start moving all the buildings along the coast inland. People just go nuts, and they don't really investigate everything that's going on. But we really don't have that threat. And as you see, you can see a lot of places, you just don't notice the sea level rise because it's so minuscule. It is weaponized, though. And people, because they don't critically think, they're not taught to critically think, they just hear a fearful story and they take it as gospel. Our media system, like National Public Radio, they always kind of throw in climate change for every event. They just, one line with it. I used to love David Attenborough because I love the photography and being an ecologist and a nature buff. But some of the stuff he's done, and he got invited to the World Economic Forum. It's really bad. It's just propaganda. It's using his great photography abilities to spread a narrative that's not connected. As you said, that there was that one anemic polar bear that this was National Geographic did that one. They filmed it and they said, this is what climate change is like. And they got pushback on that. But I think it had like 30 million views within a day, and everybody thinking, oh, this is the poor polar bear. Well, it had nothing to do with climate change. And you could think of 100 reasons. No one knew why the polar bear was sick, but people just jump on that. It's just these knee-jerk reactions. I'll just throw in, I monitored like 6 different wet meadow systems in the Sierra Nevada. And one of them crashed and all the bird life we were studying was disappearing. And I had different professors or students come in and they'd see it drying out and say, oh, that's just what climate change predicts. Oh my God, this is what it's about. Now they've only looked at it for 5 or 10 minutes, but they give me that knee-jerk reaction. I've been studying it for 15 years and measuring different things. And I knew it had nothing to do with climate because this place was one of the places in California where the maximum temperatures were higher in the 1930s than they were now. So I couldn't blame it on climate change. It turned out that it was the streams had been downgraded from an old railroad track 100 so years ago. And that caused all the water to be drain the aquifer and dry out everything, dry out the plants. So we've restored it and all the wildlife came back. But if we just jumped on the bandwagon and said, oh, that's climate change, we would never have fixed it. You go out and you'd protest or maybe glue your ass to a sidewalk or something, and nothing would have been done. But you think you're a hero saving the environment when you were actually doing the worst thing for the environment. You were ignoring what really happened and how you could fix it. And that's what made me write this book, was that if you're really an environmentalist, it's not climate change is an issue. It's landscape changes that we can fix. And then these natural cycles we can't, but be prepared to know that they're going to happen. In California, the El Niños, we get heavy rain, heavy snows. La Niñas, you get droughts. And it fluctuates you get these events every 3 to 7 years, but then it sets up the whole Pacific Ocean for like 30 years of more dryness or 30 years of more wetness. And if people understood that, they'd sleep better at night. But they get a drought and they think, oh, we're all going to die. So they've done a good job with propaganda. It's kind of
I've seen it with even Sesame Street for the children. It's sad, like. But listen, Jim, thanks a million, and I don't want to hog the stage. I'll pass it over to Carol.
Jim, yeah, regards those polar bears, I taught my nephew to look into that because he was being propagandized at school. Don't just keep his mouth. Just keep quiet. But here's another side to the story. Like the polar bears, they don't really know what their populations are doing because they didn't take any serious consensus until late in the game. I can't remember what it was. But polar bears can also swim 80 miles in the sea to go hunting. Nothing unusual about that. And what people forget is, and this is all part of the cloak and daggers sort of thing, is when they show pictures of the polar bear dying, and they say the poor bear, if you have to realize it's top of the food chain. When it loses its teeth, it can't hunt, and nothing can really attack it. So that's the way a lot of them come to their end, is by starving.
We could get in a fight with another bear, or just old age. I know for a fact that old age can wear you down.
I'm right behind you. And the other thing is the use of the word CO2 becomes, they say, the carbon budget. It's not carbon, it's the carbon dioxide I thought we were talking about, but they move it to carbon, which is different. And then they show pictures of smokestacks billowing out. Well, it's really just water vapor, but are pollutants. And they try to allude that that's CO2 belching out into the atmosphere, but CO2 is invisible. And like you say, it's plants are happier up around 800 parts per million, 1,000 parts per billion, excuse me. And we have a natural feedback system to take care of all the CO2. And it's not the baddie. It's the destruction. I like the fact that you pointed out it's the landscape. I've been saying it's the destruction of the natural habitat and messing with the natural order. That's the real threat, not the CO2 thing. That's just
one of my pet peeves is to save the environment, let's do biofuels. Now, a lot of places in the United States that I know of, and probably around the world, is they used to have marginal farms due to low technology, low fertilizer. And as farms become more technologically advanced, these marginal farms went back to the wild. But then when they started doing biofuels, they said, oh, they reclaim the land now for corn here in the Midwest United States, or Brazil for sugarcane, and in Indonesia, they're doing palm oil is a big one, and that's threatening the orangutans. So you have these environmentalists think they're stopping climate change by using biofuels, and they're really making it worse. We were headed back to restoring landscapes to be more beneficial to wildlife. And I know when I restored it, the wildlife got better than it ever did. My research station was where there was heavy gold mining in the 1800s. They totally denuded the hillsides of the forest to get wood for their mine shafts or to forge their metals. They took the streams out of the stream bed and put them in wooden boxes so they could dig up the gravel in the bottom to get to the gold. So by the late 1800s, it was like a moonscape. But now it is back. The trees are better. The wildlife is better. We've had wolves move into the area. We had wolverines that hadn't been there in 60, 70 years. And so as we stop screwing up with the landscape, the wildlife is coming back as good as it had ever been. Yet you keep hearing them say, oh, CO2 is causing ecosystems to collapse. Well, we're not seeing that. Where we allow the landscapes to come back and be more natural, the landscapes are the ecology is thriving, and it's it's to me, it's just abominable. They're just making people think about the wrong thing and make them think they're being good environmentalists when they're actually doing the wrong thing. So it's
that's it. Yeah, it's just the simple things. If people just look a little bit more carefully at the issue, they could at least entertain that something else is going on. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about the reintroduction of the wolf into Yellowstone, and it was just one species, and it changed the population and the beaver and the deer, and that changed the way the rivers would flow, or they become more stagnant, and the whole landscape would change, and the whole of nature would thrive just because of one species. But you could blame it on snowmelt. You could blame it on so many things unless you actually look a little closer. Nature is never just one simple thing that's responsible for everything.
It's so much more resilient. If the landscape is there for them, they'll do well. I used to, maybe 30, 40 years ago, help some people do whale watching trips. And we had to go out of a place just south of San Francisco and go maybe 25 miles out, and hopefully would see one humpback whale. Now I can sit and drink my coffee at the beach and see humpback whales all over the place. They've come back tremendously, and it's just a matter of not hunting them. And the ecosystems will take care of them. And I think most of the subspecies of the humpback have now been taken off the endangered list. But there's a number of the whales which you can go, it's just been simply overhunting, that now they're coming back as strong as they've ever been. But you don't see that in the media. Clickbait media just wants to tell you horror stories because, if you say everything's good, people, I don't care. But if you say, oh, you're going to die, it's, you got a whole genre of horror movies that attracts people, and they're just doing it with the media now. So,
yeah, that's it. I have a friend who works he was monitoring the coral off in Florida for climate change, and everybody says it's the acidity of the oceans is increasing, and that's got to do with climate change. But he just told me, he says, no, that's not really it. It's man's interference.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't make a good headline, and it doesn't tap the funding pools of money for research. That's, you mentioned earlier about how academia gets skewed because it's easier to write a paper that's not challenging and get published than it is to possibly lose your career. And if you don't write a proposal that's the flavor of the month, you're not going to get money, and then your career stagnates, and you don't get heard. And so that's a lot of people are under that. In big institutions, I guess that happens everywhere in everything.
There's a great story about Daniel Shechtman, and he studied crystals. And Linus Pauling, who kind of looked at how different atoms join together due to the arrangement of their electrons or whatever, said here's certain crystals that can happen, and here's theoretical crystals that will never happen. And he called them quasi-crystals. Well, this guy, Dan Shechtman, he said quasi-crystals don't exist. So, and probably I knew this because Linus Pauling's son was the chairman of my biology department at San Francisco State. But anyways, Shechtman says, I'm seeing these crystals in my lab. And Linus Pauling would get up at meetings when he tried to speak and say, there's no such thing as quasi-crystals, just quasi-scientists. And they raised such a stink. They attacked Dan Shechtman and said they wouldn't publish his stuff at first. It took him a long time to get it published. But other people in his lab finally kicked him out because they said he was bad for their funding to get any kind of funding going on. And finally, when he published and people looked, they said, oh yeah, now I see quasi-crystals. He got the Nobel Prize, and they used quasi-crystals in high surgery equipment. It's it's like he saw it, but no one wanted to believe it because, you know, one guy had created this meme. Linus Pauling was a genius. He probably would have had a third Nobel if his sons didn't give away this DNA stuff. But you know, if you don't fall in step, it's going to take years before a good skeptic can come and show you why they're a little off in what they were thinking. So there's just that way that science is not advancing as quick as it could be because certain personalities can control it. And now if you have the government take your side, all your funding, if you know government said, I want you to fund this, that's what you go for. I had a friend, they did nasal mites, and somebody else looked at leaf miners, and they're sitting around saying, how can I get my research funded and connected to climate change? That carries out there. So everybody starts looking for any minuscule connection you can do. And if you look for it that way, you can always make some kind of connection. It can be it's a false correlation, but that's all you're looking for.
Well, yeah, I mean, CO2 is ubiquitous, so you could, well, pretty much ubiquitous, so you could find funding for some weather-related CO2 type connection, you know, because it's everywhere.
One of my biggest complaints is when we look at how much CO2 is heating the earth, and I believe in a greenhouse effect. I think we have one. But it's pretty much reached its limit. It's not going to get any much worse if it does. But if we didn't have a greenhouse effect, Earth's average temperature would be below freezing. So we have a benefit from that. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is the oceans are warming. And so they say, oh, CO2 is warming the oceans and not the sun. And how they measure that warming is in the energy is measured in joules, and joules per second is watts. So everything is watts per meter squared. They try to, and so they say, oh, well, CO2 is adding 2 watts per meter squared, and that's what's causing the warming. And the thing is, the watts per meter squared from infrared doesn't warm the ocean in the same way watts per meter squared from the sun warms the ocean. The sun's energy can penetrate as deep as 100 meters, but it's going to do most of its warming in the upper 5, 10, 20 meters. I don't know if you ever swam in a cold pond. You can tread water and your body is warm, but your feet hit the cold layer below it, not warm. The infrared from CO2 only penetrates a couple of microns into the surface. I don't know if you're not familiar with microns, but if you sharpen a pencil, if people use pencils anymore, a pencil point is about 1 millimeter, and you can fit 1,000 microns on a millimeter. So the CO2 is only getting this very thin skin surface, and then it can be radiated away right away. The sun, anytime you go below that skin surface, the heat that it gives to the water has to rise to that surface by convection or conduction, and then once it's to the surface, it can radiate it away. Well, it takes days, months, and maybe years for that solar heated water to escape, compared to the infrared that only takes an instant to escape. Yet they treat them as the same thing. They say, oh, well, this is watts per meter squared, so it must be warming the ocean. I think if they really looked into this better, and I've tried to examine this, I've put it on a couple of my YouTubes to show, it's where you have a lack of clouds that allows the sun to heat the ocean more is what's warming the ocean. And we do know, all the studies will show you, is the tropical waters heat, they absorb more solar energy, but that energy is then transported further north. So the tropics, the water doesn't warm as much as it gets heated. And the places that it gets heated the most is like the Eastern Pacific, where you have El Ninos and La Ninas. When it's a La Nina, there's hardly any clouds, and it allows greater heating of the ocean. And that's the place that all the studies show that most of the heat going into the ocean is very localized to that one place. And it's somewhat similar in the Atlantic, but not quite as much as in the Pacific. And that's all solar. It has nothing to do. If you think the greenhouse gas is adding heat to the ocean, you think of it as a blanket. Well, it's not. The oceans aren't warming as a blanket. They're warming in very specific places that are connected to solar heating and a lack of clouds.
Do you think it's also got to do with tectonic plate movement or volcanic activity, heating the oceans?
People, I hear there is tectonic activity. I think it provides some kind of warmth. I don't think it's as much to explain what we're seeing. I think the solar heating of the ocean is a better explanation. I don't look at it as a major player, but it does play some part. I look at the way climate changes over the years. It has to do with tectonic activity and the way it allows warm ocean currents to heat the land. If you go back to the Cretaceous 160 million years ago, Antarctica had dinosaurs and lush vegetation on it. And that's because warm waters could surround Antarctica back then. But then as Antarctica kept separating, you got this current called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, blocked all the warm water coming from the tropics towards Antarctica, and Antarctica started cooling. And then as it started, sea ice started freezing, the cold water went to the bottom, and the whole oceans changed. And so I look at tectonic activity as rearranging ocean currents, being the more powerful dynamic. And, you know, I guess, you know, if you look Ireland or Europe, the Gulf Stream, a lot of those Northern European countries would be a lot colder if it wasn't for the Gulf Stream carrying up heat, and then it's bringing the heat from the tropics up, and then it ventilates and warms Western Europe. And if the Eastern United States might be 10 degrees warmer at the same latitude because the way the winds blow it towards Europe. So I think those are just examples of how ocean currents, once you heat that ocean water, you're going to be able to affect the climate and the transport. So most of what we're seeing in climate change, the warming, is not in the tropics, but places where the oceans are ventilating heat. So again, that's why I go to the oceans in the solar heating, because a lot of this water is warmed down to maybe 400 meters, where your underground volcanic stuff is thousands of meters deep. And I don't think it really is such a great volume of water down there. I just don't see it making the same effect.
Right. Yeah, no, I've heard that too. So I just wanted to know, you know, how negligible or significant it was.
Yeah, I haven't tried to measure, but we've had, you know, there's skeptics that Joe Bastardi is kind of a weather guy and a skeptic, and he kind of buys into the volcanic, underwater volcanics is driving it, but I disagree with it. But, you know, skeptics are not all following the same narrative. We're trying to look at it for different reasons.
So you would put, how do I put this? Climate change due to the sun, then, you know, I mean, I accept climate change is always happening.
Absolutely.
It would be stupid to think that it was static. Let's put it that way. So, so if it's always, I forget what I was going to go with that now.
At our age, that happens.
Yeah, it's happening more often. I suppose the other thing is, if it's all got to do with the sun, then essentially, I know that the climate models, they don't, and maybe this has been updated, but they don't contain things like the Milankovitch cycles, which are 400,000 year cycles of the sun, and all these, you know, these large circulations, precession of the cycles. You know, the Earth is tilted towards the sun at times, and it's closer. It's at its perihelion, and then at other times it's facing tilted the same direction, but it's much further away. And these cycles take hundreds, you know, it could be thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. They would seem to be significant in modulating weather, because you're changing all these distances and the amount of radiation. But it's very low frequency stuff in the background. Do you know if that's taken into the model of climate change?
For most of your climate models, often they're just looking at, you know, the most recent 7 decades or something. So from that point of view, it's really not going to be incorporated into most of the models. It depends what they're looking at.
Yeah.
What you said, you have what they call eccentricity, where you have more of an eclipse than a circle, and that's about every 100,000 years. So that's probably not going to affect us over the last 100 years. You have precession, which means, what I always had students, I say, in the winter, are we closer to the sun or further away? And everybody said, the winter, we're further away. Wrong.
Yeah, we're closer.
We're actually closer, but the reason we have winter is because of obliquity, which is about a 41,000-year cycle. The axis is tilted, and it varies from 24 degrees to about 21 degrees. But that's just enough to make the sun move further north and cause the ocean currents to bring more water into the Arctic, or go a little further south and not transport as much water into that. And I do see what studies have shown is our El Nino cycles, when we're at the peak of obliquity back in the Holocene 12,000 years ago, that there was hardly any El Nino events. And that's when the Arctic waters were the warmest, because the way it was tilted was bringing so much more heat into the Arctic. And now, as we're cooling, it's been slowly less and less water is being transported in the Arctic, so the Arctic has been cooling. And the greatest amount of ice happened during the Little Ice Age a few hundred years ago, where 12,000 years ago there was no sea ice in the Arctic. And again, when I was saying that La Nina conditions have caused less clouds in the tropical Pacific, Eastern Pacific, allows more heating. Almost even the skeptics like Michael Mann would say that the oceans were in an El Nino-like condition during the Little Ice Age, meaning that it was more warm water spread across the Pacific, so you had more even distribution of clouds. And then for the last 150 years, we've been more La Nina-like, which had less clouds in the Pacific and allowed more warming of the ocean. So what you see is some of these orbital cycles are affecting El Ninos that hardly ever happened 12,000 years ago. They've increased. So we got more El Nino-like stuff happened during the Little Ice Age. It comes into play, but on a framework of 15, 30,000 years is going to be more issue. And still a lot of scientists debate, is it precession, which means that axis wobbles, and depending on where the orbit is, it's pointing towards the sun or away from the sun at different seasons. But a warmer season in the north might mean a colder season in the winter. So it's balanced out. Again, but these are such long-term dynamics. It's hard for that to explain what we're seeing just over the last 100 years. But again, I think if you look at this La Nina dynamic, it can explain everything that's happened in the last 150 years. Plus, I was a co-author, but a minor player in a paper that just got published, is saying a lot of our land temperatures have been ruined by the urban heat effect. And again, that's just with the landscapes. There's a great picture of in Atlanta, Georgia, and they've done it in other places. But you look at the landscape and you can see where it's green forest and where there's city buildings. And then you take an infrared and look what the temperature is. And there's 10, 15, 20 degrees difference. And the hot places are all where the city's built. And the cold places are all where the vegetation is. So, what are we really measuring? We might be measuring a warmer global temperature, but land temperatures are being jacked up by an urban heat effect. And no one can deny that. And you could have other temperatures in the Arctic that are blooming because the ice got blown out and the heat's ventilating. So there's these different dynamics that are making the global average temperature warmer. It has nothing to do with CO2. And if you combine them all, you hide what's going on if you just make this average temperature and act like something's acting on the average temperature. It's much more regional. It's much more local. And I think that's just a horrible disservice that we're doing to educating people about how their climate's changing.
Yeah, well, one thing I've learned just by listening to you is And I know better. The ocean is not just a reservoir or a sink for heat. It also it doesn't just absorb it. It causes a redistribution.
Absolutely.
So it's heat and movement. It's this movement aspect, which is quite interesting because that affects climate.
And that was part of, as I was trying to understand what was happening to me in California, how heat was being transported, El Ninos, La Ninas. If you Google probably ocean heat flux and then click on images, you'll see where there's more heat going into the ocean than that's coming out, and then places where there's more heat coming out than's going in. And so again, you'll see these main regions where more heat is going into the ocean than is coming out is in the eastern tropical Pacific and Atlantic. And then it gets transported, the trade winds blow it around, then it goes up, in the Pacific, it's the Kuroshio current along Japan. In the Atlantic, it's the Gulf Stream up into the Norwegian current. And along those currents, you see all this heat coming out. More heat's coming out of them than it's going in. So it's this very local distribution of heat that's happening from the tropics and then spreading up and towards the Arctic that causes these temperature differences. And if you transport more heat, the northern latitudes will warm more. You transport less, and you go back to that orbital stuff. It affects how much circulation is happening. La Ninas will also, during a La Nina, the western Pacific around Indonesia, it will store heat down to 200 meters deep, and then it will circulate that heat into the Indian Ocean, down towards Australia, up along Japan, and that's warming a lot of that whole region. But it's something that started in the eastern Pacific. So it's that's, as you're saying, it's that circulation where you're is the oceans are absorbing it and then transporting it around the world, and that causes a lot of this climate change that's going around. So, and if you look at hurricanes, they typically follow some of this, where the heat's going around. So, and I'll give you an example. I try to write about this, called solar ponds. Are you familiar with solar ponds?
No, but I'm trying to guess. It's got to do with absorbing solar light.
Boy, that is very astute. And the reason I like to highlight this is it points to a dynamic that people ignore. And University of El Paso has been working with it. The Israelis have been working with it. But you can make a pond that's only about 10 feet deep. And you layer it. The bottom 5 feet might be very salty, and the upper is fresh water. So what happens is the sun comes in and it heats that lower layer that's very salty. Because of the salt is still too dense to rise to the surface and ventilate. So the heat accumulates. So on a day where you have 60, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that bottom layer can reach 180, 190 degrees. So the oceans can store that much heat just due to that kind of dynamic. And there's lots of places around the ocean where you have this a subsurface layer that's very salty, and then a freshwater layer on top, which might either be from river discharge, from the Amazon or Mississippi, or from heavy rainfall that happens along the equator. And then you have other areas like the deserts around the world. There's also sort of deserts in the ocean where there's hardly any clouds and it gets heated, high evaporation, very salty water, and all that kind of gets mixed and interlayered. And often if you see a hurricane intensify, it's because it's gone over a layer that the oceanographers will call this a barrier layer, where you have this warm, salty water that should be a little cooler, and it prevents, when the hurricane goes over, instead of allowing the colder, deeper water to come to the surface and calm the hurricane down, that layer of warm, salty water prevents that from happening. And so the hurricane intensifies. So if you look at a track of a hurricane, you might see it in the warmer tropical waters start off as just a storm, and then maybe to a 1 or 2, and then it will intensify to category 3 or 4 when it goes over a barrier layer, but only for a day maybe, and only for a small region. You know, these hurricanes aren't getting worse because of a global issue. They only intensify in these very specific regions for very specific times. And it has to do with the way the oceans store the heat in these kind of salty barrier layers.
It seems that, you know, for the oceans to heat up appreciably, they must have had an effect. What we see today must be the effect of hundreds of years ago. Would that be, is there a lag of that time, or there's many different lags and cycles?
I think what we see this warming now, a lot of the data shows the oceans were cooling during the Little Ice Age, say from 1300 to 1850. And then they've been warming since then. And so that makes me think that it's really just this switch from the oceans having a more El Nino-like character and a more even distribution of clouds versus a more La Nina factor where certain regions are really allowed to absorb a lot of heat and store it in these salty layers. So, I mean, you would think that the heat would rise to the surface and stratify, but you have this warm, salty water in the Western Pacific around Indonesia. It can get as deep as 200 meters. And
the whole thing, because I was going on the basis of this for these deep water currents to go around the world. It's something like 2,000 years, and you know, that has to be taken into account because it's distributing heat. So how can we really predict anything? I've seen papers based on meta studies saying that the sea level has risen by like something the order of 20 nanometers or something like this. But this is just a meta study. This is just a statistical kind of exercise. But it got funded because it came out showing an increase in sea level, but a fraction of a wavelength or something to that effect. So and then we're talking about these long cycles and the redistribution of heat and intensification of storms, and it's the result. It's such a complicated thing.
Absolutely.
To come out and say trust the science, these things to me, they're just anathema. It's terrible.
Most people, I read 5 peer-reviewed papers a day. And sometimes my wife catches me slumped over in a deep sleep because some of them are pretty boring. It's hard to work through, and I can't expect people without a background. I mean, just the vocabulary alone, never mind some of the concepts and the statistical analysis, it knocks most of the people out of the water. So we really need a way to educate the public in a way that doesn't put them to sleep. I've been trying to go to Twitter now and see if I can do short blurbs on Twitter, because people have a very short attention span. Just to backtrack a little on what you're saying with the oceans, there is different parts of the ocean store more heat, and the Atlantic stores some of the most of the heat deeply, and it would be hundreds of years. And I think in some places in the Pacific where that water doesn't circulate to the surface, that heat can be from 1,000 or so years ago. But most of what's affecting our climate, like an El Nino year, is ventilating heat that was stored just 200 meters deep and then washed across the Pacific and brought to the surface and releases that heat. The paradox is an El Nino causes the global average temperature to go up, but it's actually cooling the ocean. But people don't talk about it that way. They go, this extra warming and climate change and El Ninos. Well, actually, the El Nino is cooling the oceans. So it's, again, all those climate dynamics that are complex, they could be simply expressed to people, but we're not seeing it. The multimedia likes to just make this catastrophic confusion, and I'm a little nervous of where we're going.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with you. I could keep on throwing things out, so many things to discuss, but I know we're probably pressed for time, so I just want to open it up to my colleagues here. Grace, how are we doing?
Oh, Well, I'll just share this comment from a viewer, and maybe you can add on, Jim. Okay. So
Sure.
it says Vostok ice core samples show first there is a temperature rise, the 500 to 800 years later. There is a rise in CO2. These samples go back 400,000 years. It also appears the pattern has been repeating itself over these 400,000 years. So there's really no question, but maybe you can add something. I know listening to you and Carl, you both, we all in agreement that, the climate continues to change. So anything you could share?
In terms of a long-term cycle in Antarctica, I don't feel like I know enough about what might cause it. What I do know is they just pushed, the drop in sea ice in the Antarctic, and they're making a big thing about it, and it's only kind of reduced back to what it was in the 60s. But there's a circulation pattern that happened. Thing about it, and it's only kind of reduced back to what it was.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
That's all right. I just, but where the Antarctic Peninsula comes out, often you have some high heat in those areas, but it's often is caused by feign winds. Do you know what I mean when I say there's a feign wind, or you have these winds, they drop all their moisture, they warm, they go up over a mountain crest, which the Antarctic Peninsula is. And then when it descends, as the pressure increases, the temperature goes up. So when the circulation allows the winds to go around the peninsula, it's colder. And when the winds go over and down, they have these high, near record temperatures along the peninsula. But often the media will say, oh, the hottest temperature ever in Antarctica. It was at the very tip, which is nearest the warm ocean waters that are being come from the tropics and due to a feign wind event. In the inner place where you're saying the Vostok ice cores, I'm not sure exactly how those cycles change. I do know that I can tell you more about how the sea ice is changing, the way the pressure system, all the sea ice it expands when there's strong winds blowing away from the continent, and it shrinks when you got winds coming in. And pressure systems will do that because there's a circle, on one side, and there's a thing called the Amundsen low pressure system. So on its eastern side, the winds are blowing in, and you get less ice. But on its western side, it's blowing out, and you get expansive ice. So if they average together, you lose sight of that. But this low ice in the Antarctic, sea ice, is because of the way that kind of pattern causes ice to contract and expand. And there is been papers about cycles where different places the pressure systems change, and so ice grows in some places, and then the 180 degrees away it's decreasing. So exactly how all that works, I don't feel like I know enough to ramble. So
Thank you anyway for sharing your thoughts on that. And since you do a lot on the videos and your YouTube, what else do you think needs to happen in the educational system? There's a lot of homeschooling, there's a lot of micro school, but they do need some materials, every conversation we have is we always think of the children.
I think my videos are probably a little too scientific for anybody that's a senior in high school or lower. But the CO2 Coalition has an education committee, and I sit in on that. And they've come up with a number of comic books, which I had little to do with, but other people, and we're distributing. But some places they get banned. I know they went to an education conference, and people kicked them out because it wasn't the right narrative to be telling. But we're trying to do that kind of education for kids at different levels, and the committee's looking at how can we expand the range of the ages that you're going to target, because different ages are going to require a different way of presenting this stuff. So I can only hope it gets better. I think homeschoolers are more open to it, or at least, teaching critical thinking. Your public schools, I think the politics, at least in California, it tends to be pretty aligned with left-wing thinking that it's climate change and everybody hates fossil fuels, so that must be causing the destruction, and that's the only thing you want to teach. But other than what we're doing, there's another group that's trying to reach out to kids. He was a senator in Arkansas, I think. His group is doing climate change for kids, but those are the only two that I'm really aware of right now.
No, thank you. Maybe I'll try to search on that senator in Arkansas.
Yeah, and go to the CO2 Coalition's website, and they have a kids education page, and you can see what they have offered. And you can ask them. You ask Greg to send you some of the comic books, so you get an understanding of what we're doing.
Okay, and there's, I think, more than one time you've been invited to present or speak, have a conversation in, it's a financial podcast. I brought that up because the question is, who's truly benefiting? And if they are weaponizing climate change, they're always having that agenda. The pandemic has been happening, and they said, okay, the next agenda is climate change. So who's truly benefiting, and why would a financial podcaster even want to invite you? So what's in it for investments?
Well, I think you're referring to my last San Francisco Economic Roundtable, where I was invited to speak. And a friend of mine from the university is a member of that. And that roundtable is almost anybody who wants to rise in the politics of the area kind of joins that roundtable for a while. And some people have been there for a long time. It depends on who you talk to. It's a mixed bag of people's beliefs. And so, who benefits from the economics of it? I don't think you could look at that group as much. Again, I think there's people are afraid of the power of the fossil fuel industry. They want to control energy, and they want to do it their way on their time. And I think those people are the ones that are trying to control stuff and trying to keep this narrative that fossil fuels are going to cause us all to die. And I'm amazed. I see people on Twitter saying, climate change is causing thousands of people to die every day. I've been accused of killing people for asking a question. Just by questioning, they think we're killing folks. So I think some people are, it's like Chicken Little just got so obsessed with something fearful that they really believe it. I think others are trying to manipulate the economics. The government can screw up an economic system pretty quickly. So, I think it's a mixed bag of who we have to worry about. And hopefully, as more people understand the science, they might become better critical thinkers and be able to see past some of the fear mongering that's been going on. But there's certainly a lot of fear mongering trying to control us. So, who's trying to control us? I don't know if I could put my finger on anybody, but the United Nations stands out to me as they've been pushing it, where they're saying the oceans are boiling. We're all going to die. This Guterres has been making all these proclamations. Al Gore seems to be aligned with all that. He's saying the oceans are boiling, and it's just nonsense. It's nonsense. It's just pure fear mongering for control. Vote for me and I'll set you free.
Well, just so you know, we're tweeting in Twitter, or we're streaming in Twitter. So I'll tag you. So that could be your inspiration to start doing your videos more in Twitter, as you mentioned.
Well, that's what I've been trying to do is I'll give a link to my videos and I'll get some increase. But I have maybe, a good tweet, I'll get 30,000 views, and but I might get 100 people go over to the YouTube site. As I said, most people don't have the attention span of a gnat. They'll listen to something for 30 seconds and then they're gone. So, but I feel like that's kind of my two-prong attack right now. And also, all my videos have my other website called Perhaps All Natural. I try to put the transcripts of most of my videos over there because some people would rather read than listen. It moves too fast. So.
And just for additional fun information for the viewers, we do use a binocular infrared, and it's very interesting on what you can see, because you mentioned that, and you could see which parts are more heated up or something, and that's like the military uses that. So for our education, it's good to get some gadgets and have a little hobby on
You can get a very cheap infrared gun. And I used this when I was teaching some ecology classes. We'd have a wet meadow where it's drier at the top and wetter at the bottom, and it proceeds. But you can have, just within a meadow, the ground's temperature will be 30 to 100 degrees difference at midday, because depending on how much moisture is there, depending on what kind of vegetation is there. And you can do that with these infrared guns. They're fairly cheap. I forget what they would cost right about now, but probably not much more than $20. And just look around and see how varied temperatures are. People use it to look at their house for insulation. Where is the heat escaping? And you can see 5-10 degrees. And you realize that there's so much variation in temperature. How do you get a global average that doesn't have a lot of uncertainty to it? What areas are you really counting? And it's mostly weather stations that are in urban centers. A lot of the weather stations move to airports, and you probably put an infrared heat gun to a runway, and it's going to be pretty hot. If you ever walked across pavement in bare feet, I try to be manly about it, but sometimes I go, ooh, it's pretty hot stuff.
and perhaps it would be nice if you can end us with, you have that little story about the man who was on fire or something, and it was a very good story on how there's a lot of misinformation, or they're not looking totally on what's happening with the climate. Do you remember that story? You mentioned that in one of your podcasts. One the foot is on the ice, and the other one is on something hot, and then that man called the doctor. You remember that?
I'm vaguely, but I'm a little.
And then when that,
I can't quite remember right at this second, but as some of the older folks here can testify, some of those things don't come to mind right away. Probably as I'm lying down ready to fall asleep tonight, I say, "Oh yeah, that's what it was."
But basically, you were just showing that man was when the wife called the doctor, and the doctor was
yes.
Remember that?
One foot was in the oven and one was in the freezer, and the doctor came and took his temperature and says, "Gee, I don't see what the problem is. On average, his temperature is perfect." So,
and so, please, thank you very much, and do tell if you have any more pressing insights. Please do so, and again, tell everyone where to get in touch with you while I continue to post and do some checkers.
I'll put out a tweet linking to your website. So send me, where would be the best place to send people to see what you're producing?
Oh, thank you for the question. So we will upload this, and it's streaming in Rumble right now. It's streaming in Quantum Nurse Rumble and the Quantum Nurse Twitter, but it will also be on BitChute or Rumble of BitChute of Roy. So all of us share this information. That's the beautiful thing of this, because we make it more powerful by sharing. Sure. So it will be in BitChute, Rumble, Brighteon, and that's all the videos, but it will also be in a lot of audio. Okay, and there's that info. I have this banner for Jim's. Well, anyway, say your email again, please, Jim.
Okay, my email is jsteele@sfsu.edu. And if you send me your email of where you have this posted out, I put up on my Twitter account, here's my interview
Yes.
with your place. So
Yes. Will do. Anything more, guys? Roy, Carl? So, thank you so much.
No, we've covered so thanks very much, Jim. Really appreciate it.
And we've covered quite a bit, but there's still a lot more.
Yeah, there is. I don't want to say anything because I'll open up another conversation. But yeah, very nice to meet you, and thank you so much.
You too.
Yeah.
Glad to meet all of you.
And please, we'll make sure that we'll invite you again because as you said, there's so much more to talk about. Thank you.
I'm retired, and my whole mission in life is to make sure we get the science right. I survived a Widowmaker heart attack, one of the 10% lucky people that have, a couple of years ago. So I feel like, okay, I got to go down and swing it. That's what I'm doing.
And to all our viewers and followers, and please, help us disseminate the right information, okay, especially for our children and for all of us there who's still making it every single day the best of our days. Take care and source bless.
Thank you. Bye.
So I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. You'll find everything about me on bio.link/podcaster with all my podcasts, and you'll find it you see in the QR code in the graphic that's shown. I'd like again to thank my sponsors. So if you or someone you know struggling with anxiety and want to know how to be 100% anxiety free in 6 weeks without therapy or drugs, Daniel Packard's Anxiety Solution Program company offers a 6-week system that permanently solves anxiety at an astounding 90% success rate. People who join the program only pay at the end once they have clear, measurable results. If you're interested in learning more, go to permanentanxietysolutions.com, where you can book a free consultation with Daniel. Do you fight blood pressure and or want to get off the meds? Doctors are amazed at what Zona Plus can do. You can get a $50 discount with my code ROY, zona.com/discount/ROY, and you'll see it in the QR code as well as Daniel's QR code. Quality manufacturer of metal products for telecommunication and workshop equipment and other metal materials. You see the brochure there in the QR code, and let me know if you would like a quotation, shipped internationally at very competitive price. I'd like to thank all my sponsors and also all my listeners. Be sure to give me a thumbs up, 5-star rating, share with your friends, really helps. And I also have a video on how to give a 5-star rating because a lot of people have wrote to me asking me that they don't know how to do that. Until next week, take care.